By 1942, Italy stood at a crossroads. Its armoured divisions had once rolled confidently across deserts and plains, but the war had changed. The Allies unleashed Sherman after Sherman, machines Italy's tanks could no longer match. The Regio Esercito was left with a haunting question. With outdated steel and dwindling resources, how could they fight back? Out of that desperation, a new shape emerged, low, squat, and armed with a gun that could blow open the mightiest American tank. Italy's most dangerous war machine was born. They called it the Semovente M43 de 105-25, but for the men who fought inside and those who feared its bite, it had another name, the Bassotto. By 1942, the Regio Esercito faced a reality it could no longer ignore. Its tanks were obsolete, and its soldiers stood against ever stronger Allied armour. Italy needed a new weapon, fast. Performance of the Semovente de 75-18 had been positive in North Africa, often pushed forward for direct fire combat to compensate the problem of the Carro Medio, M1340s and M1441s being no match for Allied mediums like the M4 Sherman. Italy's development of medium tanks saw only incremental changes with each model, from the series of M1340s, the M1441 and the M1542. The M1542 had only just been pressed into service, but severely lacking the requirements for modern combat. The Carro M tanks were adequate for infantry support, but in anti-tank roles they were becoming increasingly deficient to the point of obsolescence. The Regio Esercito recognised that the Allies' technological improvements in tanks deployed on the front lines required the Italian army to field a vehicle to counter the threat. The Semovente de 75-18 model, though successful, would be lacking the firepower as the war progressed. The Regio Esercito needed more, a solution that an ordinary tank could not fulfill. The Inspectorate of Artillery of the Royal Italian Army ordered the creation of a more powerful SPG, a greater improved version of the 75-18 with a powerful 105mm gun and more frontal armour. A gun powerful enough to counter new Allied tanks that were improving with each model that entered the battlefield, and armour to withstand the fire from the common 75mm gun used on the Sherman tanks. The Regio Esercito turned to Italian industry to submit a solution. Two ideas were put forward, one from the company Udera Terni Orlando, abbreviated to Otto, and the Fiat Ansaldo Consortium. Otto's idea was to use the chassis of the Carro Armato P40. The only problem was that the P40 project was slow in its development and lacking the production of available chassis. The project was still only in the prototype stage. It would be a better platform for a more heavily armoured self-propelled gun. Fiat Ansaldo proposed an idea for the construction of a vehicle based on the platform of the M1542, a vehicle that was already in production and entering service. Fiat Ansaldo put forward the following arguments for their design. The lighter vehicle would mean the use of a smaller petrol engine to power the vehicle. Italy were already experiencing a shortage of diesel. This explains why the engine type transferred from a diesel engine to a petrol model on the M1542 tank. The previous M1340 and M1441 models used diesel engines. The vehicle, although smaller and less armoured, would be better for concealment on the battlefield. As the M1542 was already in production, components required for the new SPG model would be easy to procure, and production could begin earlier and completed faster. Time constraints were always an issue for the Regio Esercito, and this ultimately decided which idea won the contract. Disruption to assembly lines would be minimal. This would always come into the equation of which tank designs were chosen for production. Some designs might take as much as 2 years to build a production line for the tank building, so the proposal for a new design by Fiat Ansaldo was given the backing of the Regio Esercito. From desperation came ambition, a bold idea to craft a weapon Italy hoped could level the battlefield. The answer for a new SPG took shape on the bones of an existing tank, Engineers stripped away the turret, strengthened the armour, and gave it a powerful new bite. But that new bite did not come from the factories of Fiat Ansaldo. Otto had designed a 23 caliber howitzer. Ansaldo had their own version, a 20 caliber barreled gun. Ansaldo's gun was rejected, and the Otto design was chosen by the Regio Esercito. A prototype of the gun was completed by mid-January 1943. The final design extended the caliber in length to 25. The gun was named the Obice de 105-25. Around a week later, Fiat Ansaldo completed the first full prototype of the vehicle. As usual with vehicle prototypes that pass through factories, several parties would inspect the prototype to assess combat potential and performance. Central Studi della Motorizzazione, CSM, the Inspectorate of Artillery, and the Inspectorate of Motorised and Armoured Troops would assess the vehicle. CSM oversaw the testing of the prototype. Testing took place for a month, and after the trials, Regio Esercito were happy with its performance, especially the firepower of the gun. The design of the prototype would see a number of changes made from the original chassis of the M1542 tank. The width of the chassis was increased from 2.20 metres to 2.40 metres. The height was decreased by 10 centimetres compared to the Semovente M43 model. This continued the concept of a low silhouette vehicle, providing a harder target to hit for the enemy. The turret being removed, the vehicle now became a casemate, gun positioned at the front for forward firing. Frontal armour was boosted from 50mm that you would see on the Semovente M43 to 70mm, with the sides at 45mm thick. Construction methods remained the same as with other Italian tanks of the time, mostly bolted construction with some parts riveted. The M1542 chassis also meant that the new vehicle would retain the leaf spring bogie suspension system, a suspension that by now was seriously outdated. But as the vehicle would be a lighter design, it would not be as much of a hindrance as with vehicles like the Kawamato P40 and Semovente M43 that could not reach top speeds. The engine used was the V8 Fiat Spar 15TB liquid-cooled gasoline engine with 190 horsepower that powered the vehicle. The Semovente could reach a top speed of 35 to 38 km per hour, but it could be severely limited on rough terrain, as little as 10 km per hour. The speed might not have been great, but it was adequate for the type of vehicle and combat role it was designed for. The full designation was Semovente Fiat Ansaldo su Scafo M43 de 105-25. This translates to self-propelled gun Fiat Ansaldo on hull M43 armed with 105-25. This was often abbreviated to Semovente M43 de 105-25. The M43 designation reflecting that the chassis was different from the M42 used for earlier Semovente models. The nickname Bassotto came about because crews that first used the vehicle noticed its low profile, but wider, likened to the Dachshund breed of dogs, short and squat. The howitzer was installed into a ball mount like on the 75-18 design in the centre of the hull. Gun depression was good at -12 degrees, elevation limited at 22 degrees. But as with the Semovente M43, these vehicles were designed mainly as medium-range artillery and for closer support. The extra firepower of the higher caliber Otto gun would improve range, but it was not meant for long-range battery deployment. Maximum range would be around 4,500 metres with 510 metres per second muzzle velocity. Gun traverse horizontally was limited to only 16 to 18 degrees. The Semovente M43 de 105-25 would have HE rounds, but also the Effetto Pronto shell. This heat shell allowed the self-propelled gun to be effective at closer ranges. Effective ranges would be at 1,000 metres with a penetration of 76mm, enough to take care of Shermans. A secondary armament was available on the top of the casemate, the common tank machine gun, the 8mm Breda Modello 38. This was carried inside, but when needed could be mounted on the roof for anti-infantry or anti-aircraft defence. Only 3 crew operated the vehicle, and it shared the weakness of many of the Italian tracked vehicles of the time, where the commander would also operate as the gunner. This would interfere with his duties as a commander to observe battlefield situations and coordinate the crew. The driver also had the dual role of driving the vehicle and using the radio. Only the loader had one role to fulfill, loading ammunition into the breech. Italian constraints and production limitations meant that the final production model of the Semovente M43-105-25 would have its deficiencies. But what World War II vehicle was perfect? It was no majestic predator, but a stubborn little hound, ready to fight back. In war, even the finest designs crumble without industry to sustain them. Italy's military industry in the Second World War was hampered by chronic limitations that stood in stark contrast to its Axis partner, Germany. While Germany mobilised a vast industrial base, capable of reorganising into a war economy that produced thousands of tanks, aircraft and heavy vehicles annually, Italy's industrial foundation was far smaller and less modernised. The Italian tank factories were concentrated in a handful of companies, Fiat Ansaldo foremost among them, lacking both the scale and mechanisation required for mass production. Where Germany could shift resources and streamline designs for efficiency, Italy struggled with shortages of raw materials, outdated equipment, and competing demands from its navy and air force. These constraints directly affected the Semovente M43 Bassotto, designed as Italy's answer to the German Sturmgeschütz and to counter heavy Allied armour. It was a technically sound concept, but produced in only a limited number, around 30 to 40 before the armistice. Production bottlenecks meant that prototypes and small batches reached frontline units just as the nation collapsed in 1943, far too late to influence the wider war. In effect, the Bassotto illustrates the broader failure of Italian industry to keep pace with its allies. Where German armoured development could flood the battlefield with variants, Italy's armoured innovations remained rare, almost boutique weapons, brave in conception, but starved of the industrial backbone they needed to survive. The initial order for the vehicles as part of the contract with Fiat Ansaldo was 454 to be built. Production never reached this figure. The Fiat Ansaldo consortium, the backbone of Italy's armoured vehicle production, faced enormous strain during the later years of the war. By 1942 to 43, shortages of critical raw materials, particularly high-quality steel and fuel, were crippling Italian industry. Much of the country's limited resources were drained by competing demands from the army, navy and air force, leaving factory managers unable to maintain consistent production runs. Even when the design of vehicles like the Semovente M43 Bassotto was finalised, the parts needed to assemble them often arrived late, in insufficient numbers, or not at all. On top of these shortages, Allied bombing campaigns in northern Italy increasingly targeted industrial centres, disrupting not only the Fiat Ansaldo plants in Turin and Genoa, but also railways and supply networks that fed them. As transportation collapsed under air attack, even basic components, engines, transmissions, and other small components could not always be delivered to assembly lines intact. The wider Italian supply chain, already fragile and dependent on outdated infrastructure, buckled under the pressure. By 1943, Fiat Ansaldo's ability to turn out vehicles was reduced to a trickle, and projects like the Bassotto, promising on paper, never reached the numbers needed to make a strategic difference. When the armistice came, only a handful of those machines had rolled out of the factory gates, symbols of a nation whose industrial base had collapsed under the weight of war. The first batch of the new Semovente vehicle was ordered in February 1943 and delivered later in May and June of that year. The vehicles that were built early on, only around 24 to 30 built, would be supplied to Semovente armoured groups, the 601st Gruppo Carrozzato and 602nd Gruppo Carrozzato. Deployment of the vehicles would be to support the Carro P40 that was beginning production, and later the P43, which was still in the stages of early design and development. The 601st Gruppo Carrozzato was assigned to the newly formed 135th Armoured Cavalry Division, Ariete II, and the 602nd Gruppo Carrozzato was assigned to the 1st Tank Division M. For the 601st Gruppo Carrozzato, they would soon see action in Rome. September the 8th, 1943. Italy signs an armistice with the Allies, but for Rome, peace does not arrive. Instead, the German army, once Italy's Axis partner, turns its strength against its former ally. In the confusion that followed the armistice, scattered Italian units made the decision to fight back. Among them were tank crews armed with Italy's newest creation, the Semovente M43, nicknamed the Bassotto, the Dachshund. Developed as an improvement over the Carro M series of tanks, the Bassotto mounted a powerful 105mm gun on a low, compact chassis. It was Italy's answer to the heavy armour appearing on battlefields across Europe, a weapon designed with armour, firepower and resilience in mind. But few were built, and fewer still would fire in anger. On the morning of September the 9th, German armoured columns pushed to take the city. The Italian 135th Armoured Cavalry Division Ariete II deployed what little strength it had. Among its defenders, Bassotto self-propelled guns positioned on Rome's southern approaches. For the first time, the Bassotto fired in combat. Its 105mm shells struck the advancing German panzers, shocking the invader back step by step. For hours, Rome fought. Italian soldiers, side by side with hastily armed civilians, stood their ground. But Rome was not to be saved. With the king and government fleeing south, the defenders lacked orders, reinforcements and hope. By September the 10th, the Bassottos were knocked out or abandoned, their crews captured. The Ariete II's stand, symbolised by the Semovente Bassotto, showed what Italian industry might have achieved. Yet in those final days it became less a weapon of war and more an emblem of resistance, of soldiers who chose to fight even when their nation could no longer stand behind them. The Bassotto's roar was brief, but in that brief moment it carried the weight of a nation's last defiance. When Italy fell, Germany did not mourn the Bassotto. They seized it. As the Germans occupied central and northern parts of Italy, production of the Semovente M43 stopped temporarily. Inspections carried out by the Panzertruppe of the surviving vehicles in Rome and those at the production factories deemed the vehicle to be highly effective. The Germans already had extensive operational experience with the Stug series of assault guns. They saw the potential of the 105-25 Bassotto. The vehicle would become a local substitute for these assault guns and assigned to defend German occupation in Italy. The Semovente was given a Stug designation, Beutepanzer Sturmgeschütz M43 mit 105-25 853I. The Germans had seized over 20 surviving 105-25 vehicles after the armistice. The Fiat Ansaldo factories, now controlled by the Wehrmacht, were ordered to continue the production of the vehicle. Around 90 were built for the Germans during the rest of the Italian campaign. Unlike the M series of tanks and older models of Semoventi that were ordered to the Balkans for anti-partisan work, the Bassotto would be used in mainland Italy for defence and combat use. Some were sent to the Gothic line for defensive deployment. The vehicles were given to assault gun brigades and regiments, part of panzer and infantry divisions. Its role would be as an anti-tank vehicle, not artillery. As with several of the Italian vehicles seized by the Germans, they suffered from a lack of spare parts for mechanical repairs and ammunition. They were not always operational. The Germans rated the vehicle highly, but had the same complaints as the Semovente M43 used in the deserts of North Africa: poor ergonomics with tight, cramped crew compartments and insufficient frontal armour, even with the 70mm of frontal armour on the newer model. Some sources claim that the Germans added a fourth crew member, which could improve the commander's ability to coordinate the crew, but this would certainly contribute to the cramped conditions that the crews were complaining about. It is possible that other changes may have been made. For instance, Germans often installed their own radio systems in the tanks of other nations that lacked radios, like the captured Char B1s in France. The Breda Modello 38 machine gun may have been replaced with a German machine gun supplied with German ammunition. Under difficult circumstances, the Germans managed to keep the 105-25s in service through to 1945. Cannibalising other damaged or destroyed Bassottos was one way to source parts and spares for repair to keep them in service. They were efficient in defensive positions. These vehicles were valued for their powerful 105mm gun, good armour, reliability and low silhouette, making them effective for defence tasks, especially along the Gothic line and in northern Italy. The Germans also used some of the guns from damaged or surplus Semovente D105-25 units in the Alpine bunkers, indicating an efficient reuse of components to sustain the vehicle's operational availability. The production and deployment to German units, as well as usage by the Italian Social Republic forces allied with Germany who received one vehicle, contributed to the Semovente D105-25's presence and serviceability until the end of the campaign in 1945. After the armistice, the Bassotto saw an end to its service with the Royal Italian Army, but it had a new master that could demonstrate its bite until the end of the war. The Semovente D105-25 was born too late and too few, but it became one of Italy's most powerful fighting vehicles of the war. The vehicle has an odd legacy. A Semovente that was highly respected by those that used it, in particular the Germans. Allies feared its potency, but strategically it was insignificant because there were so few, similar to another powerfully gunned Semovente that the Italians built, the Semovente D1953. When there are so few vehicles built, it is hard for them to make the difference in large-scale conflict. But unlike the Semovente D1953, the Bassotto was a well-balanced vehicle that could be used equally well in offensive and defensive positions. Technically, it was the best vehicle built by the Italians of World War II, and yet did not have the same combat service and success than its predecessor, the Semovente D75-18. The vehicle stands out for having firepower and protection, two of the fundamental factors of tank doctrine, the mobility being the only thing lacking, but not the worst for its time. This proves that the Italians knew a thing or two about tank design and were moving in the right direction for the nation's tank development. This triangular balance shapes how military forces employ tanks in combined arms operations, influencing their role in manoeuvre warfare and battlefield dominance. The triangular tank doctrine may be a modern conceptualization, but I do believe the Italian engineers and army, as did the Germans, recognised the importance of these three factors in tank design, but sometimes undermined by what was available and complexity of the design. It amuses me when people refer to the Italians as incompetent at developing tanks during World War II. Much of the evidence that I have researched so far is quite the contrary. Hampered by other factors like industrial capacity and lack of materials, had a negative impact, but concepts and designs were impressive, if not always well executed due to the limitations. The Italians demonstrated ingenuity with creative and modern designs that couldn't be realised to scale. There is one critical feature of Italian tank engineering that I think should have been addressed: the leaf spring bogie suspension system. Having now researched the later vehicles built, such as the Bassotto, the Carro Armato P40 and the Semovente D1953, this outdated suspension system really held back the potential of these otherwise progressive designs. Fiat Ansaldo stuck with this suspension when really they should have moved away from it. For example, the suspension system used for the Celere Sariano would have been a better choice, but time constraints and its complexity would have influenced Fiat Ansaldo's decision not to use it, preferring to use an existing tank chassis. The Semovente M43 D105-25 Bassotto was another missed opportunity, another vehicle that was built too late to make the difference and turn the tide against the Allies. Italy's tank engineers had created another vehicle that only adds more to the intrigue of what might have been. In the end, the Bassotto was not the weapon that saved Italy, yet it remains a symbol, stubborn, underestimated, and dangerous in its way, a steel hound of war remembered long after its short-lived fight.